Do boop ba da ba dee boop boo. Hey everybody, welcome to Poduty in the News for Tuesday, April 7th, 2026. We've got 6 great stories coming to you live from our podcast theater in downtown Tarentum, PA. We've got John Taylor joining us, founder of Act 3 Agency, the LDO method. We're going to learn all about that coming up. John, do you know what time it is?
It's Poduty time.
What time is it? What time is it? It's time for Poduty and the news. Poduty and the news. The only live news podcast about podcasting from the stage. Poduty and the news. Poduty and the news. The only live news podcast about podcasting from the stage.
The only live news podcast about podcasting from the stage. It's John Taylor. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here. And I love my dance up top there. That's pretty much the way I dance. So that was an accurate portrayal.
Just swaying back and forth.
Sometimes I kind of
I like,
sway. Yeah.
sometimes I like to snap my fingers behind my back like I'm at a wedding. Yeah.
Do the overbite.
Yeah. Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah.
John, I'm really glad to have you here today. You got a lot of experience. You got agency experience. You have some entertainment experience. We're going to learn all about this. The Act 3 Agency is one thing that caught my attention. Tell us a little about what you've been building over there at Act 3.
Sure. So I started my own agency about 3, maybe 4 years ago, and quickly sort of fell into the podcast marketing niche. Been doing digital marketing for about 20 years, but had started podcasting back in 2016, 2017. So what we've really been focused on is the intersection of podcasting and artificial intelligence. And with a special sort of emphasis on how that's going to affect podcast marketing. With a special emphasis on how that affects growth and conversions. So we specialize basically in working with B2B podcasters, B2C podcasters on how to create more growth, more listeners, more discoverability for their podcast, and how to increase those all-important conversions from just interest to listeners to customers and clients.
Now, the Listener Discoverability Optimization, I was reading your website, and if you employ some of those tactics, some of the gains that you've seen from some clients is 70% increase in listenership. Tell us, how does that happen? Because I know a lot of podcasters listening to this show want to, how can I grow my show by 70%?
Sure. It's, the bottom line is how are you creating discoverability to your ideal listener and or ideal client profile? And that's really it's sort of a 2-layer approach. It requires that you're optimizing your digital platforms, your entire digital ecosystem, that all those touch points that your podcast has out there on the internet. All of those platforms are optimized to their highest and best use. And then on top of that layer is the marketing content layer, the what kind of copy you're creating and posting across this ecosystem. And is that copy really accentuating the key differentiators, the core concepts, the brand language of your podcast? And if all these things are working together, then you're increasing the foundational discoverability of your podcast. A good example is YouTube, right? A lot of people say, oh yeah, I have to have my video on YouTube because that's what you have to do. But the approach you have to take is that, no, YouTube is a search engine. And it's the number 2 search engine owned by the number 1 search engine. And you have to treat it like a search engine. You have to position your content like it's a search engine. You have to create copy, your description has to be optimized for the way a search engine would look at it and find it. Your playlists have to be optimized by topic, and So it's this kind of approach where you're basically doing the highest and best use of the platforms you're on, combined with copy that is optimized for that platform. And then what you see as a result of this is way more impressions than you probably thought imaginable, and therefore more conversions into listeners and clients.
Yeah, check that all out. I have all the links in the show notes. Also, John becomes part of Poduty and the crew after today. On the website, we have a special page dedicated to every guest co-host that's ever been on the show. All of John's links, the links to his website, links to where we're talking about the LDO method, that'll all be in the show notes. So make sure you check it out. Check out the crew page. Really connect with John. If you have like an email list, or do you have something that you like to do to really entice people to connect with you?
Absolutely. We do have a website. It's podcastmarketing.site, S-I-T-E. So podcastmarketing.site. You can reach out to me individually, John at act3agency.com. That's ACT, the number 3 agency.com. And if you reach out to me, in any way, we'd be happy to do a free strategic analysis of your podcast. We'll just sort of walk through in a video every touch point that your podcast has and how it could be optimized for greater growth and conversions.
Awesome. Check those out in the show notes. John, are you ready for our stories?
Let's do it.
We got story number 1. We're going haunted from Haunties the Headliners. This story is the perfect example of what happens when a podcast stops thinking like a show and starts thinking like a community. Let's Get Haunted built in a loyal audience by involving listeners in everything from feedback to inside jokes. And that connection led to their first live show with over 100 fans in the room. With support from Spotify's Radar program, they didn't just grow downloads, they created an experience. This is the shift that we talk about all the time. Your audience is not just listening, they're waiting for a reason to show up. And as John, you might tell from this theater space, I'm very bullish on live events. I'm very bullish on podcasters getting out there. And here's an example here's Spotify recognizing that we can build these types of experiences, these types of communities for our podcasters and for our audience, and put them together in a room and give something, I think it's much more unique than just downloading an MP3 file. You're going to walk away with stories and experiences.
And connection, which is the number one thing that everyone's looking for a great story and to connect with that story. And to, and in that case, what they're really doing is they're breaking down that fourth wall, right? You're able to talk directly with your audience and involve them in the podcast, involve them in what is happening, not just talking to them, even if there are live in a room. You're not just, giving them a TED Talk, for example. You're involving them. And like I said, that breaks down that fourth wall, and it is a level of engagement that you can't get any other way.
And I love this as an example, too. A lot of podcasters, they hear that my theater space, it only holds 40 people. Well, here's Spotify, which globally is a powerhouse, and they're putting together small, intimate podcasting events. This one is 100 people. This works for all levels of podcasting, and most podcasters are at a smaller, independent, podcaster level. They're not receiving major distribution. So if Spotify is putting together events with 100 people, start to think this could be something that's possible for my podcast. I might be able to draw 20, 30 people to come see me, and now your world starts to open up when you start performing live.
Absolutely. Because you never know, too, the effects of the word of mouth from that. If you had 20 new listeners and they all had this incredible kind of new experience, just think of how many people they're going to talk to about that.
Yeah, that butterfly effect. You don't know who's going to be in that audience. It could be somebody who has a cousin who knows somebody who's in the industry, and all of a sudden you're doing shows at Comic-Cons and South by Southwest.
Absolutely.
Let's go on to our second story today. We're going to dare to disrupt at Penn State. I threw this story in. My daughter is a Penn State student right now, and this is happening at Penn State University. This story shows you how podcasts are becoming more than content. They're becoming events. Penn State's Dare to Disrupt podcast is celebrating its 50th episode with a live show that brings together students, alumni, and entrepreneurs for a full experience, not just a recording. You have a fireside chat, a live podcast, audience Q&A, and even a networking reception after. This is what happens when a podcast becomes a platform. It creates opportunities for connection, collaboration, and real-world engagement beyond the download.
That's terrific. You know what I like the most about that is the Q&A session. In a live Q&A, your expertise is tested, and you can't lie about it. You're on the spot. You have a question there. You need to answer it. You need to sound eloquent. You need to sound like, you know what you're talking about. And since podcasting is so much about building authority and showing your expertise and building trust, if you can do that on the spot with a question you don't know about, live in front of an audience, then you're on your game and you've proved it.
Yeah, nothing shows credibility like showing up in the moment, embracing those moments, embracing those questions. Thing that I liked the most too was, I believe afterwards, did I see there was some snacks afterwards? So these are receptions, too. These are events where people are gathering and networking. And when you go to an event like this, it's a business event, a business podcast, you're going to meet other people who are probably studying the same things that you are on campus. You're going to make connections. You'll even make connections with probably the hosts and the guests of that episode. And that just starts to open your door. It's like turning on faucets for connections. And you turn on another faucet, you're making some more connections. And the more you turn on, the faster that bathtub fills up and the faster you meet the right people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that word of mouth that we were talking about before. When you start to get in front of these live audiences and these larger audiences, and you're creating this deeper level of engagement than you can get from the podcast itself, that snowball starts to roll down the hill a little bit faster, and you really pick up a special kind of momentum that way.
Yeah, I love it. And this is an event we're seeing more and more on college campuses as a way to expand the curriculum, as a way to show students that there are real-world things that can happen after you leave here, that you can make these connections and you can share that education, and it kind of like comes full circle. You leave the college, you will go develop your skills in your career, and then people come back and they're doing these live panels and giving the next generation of students a whole new perspective on what's possible.
Yeah, it's great.
Let's keep it going. We're going to go to some Star Trek conventions.
Yes, speaking my language.
This story highlights a different kind of live podcast, one that starts as a panel and turns into content. At WonderCon, a group of podcasters and superfans took to the stage to break down the controversy around Starfleet Academy. And that conversation didn't stay in the room. It became a podcast episode. This is a great reminder that live podcasting doesn't always need to start as a show. It can start as a moment. Panels, discussions, and events are all opportunities to create content that lives far beyond the stage. And you mentioned, John, that this is right up your alley.
Yeah. I've been a Trekkie or Trekker, I guess they say, all my life. So I love seeing content like that, and it's great because it's kind of like you're saying. It's bigger than the podcast, right? You have this panel of experts that are going to take this topic and run with it in directions that you'd never thought of before. So what better thing to do than put a microphone and some recording equipment in there and preserve it as a podcast, with real plan or real structure. You're just automatically going off of the expertise of these panelists. To me, that's the best kind of content you can get. Not just improvised, but improvised expertise. Just it's to me, it's kind of like the ultimate form of the content.
Yeah, I think building off of your listener discoverability optimization, what better way to optimize than to go where your audience is already gathering. So you know that this conference already has Trekkies, it has sci-fi people. If you're doing a sci-fi podcast, that's probably a place that you want to consider going. Or how do you get on their radar? How do you become part of their event? You can really find a whole new group of people to listen to your podcast if you go where they're already gathering.
100%. And if you understand that they gather in places like that, you know that trekkers go to Comic-Con and WonderCon and all the different kinds of conventions that are out there, then you can sort of take a step back and say, I'm going to make more content that is designed to reach those people. And, where it pertains to like listener discoverability optimization is like, okay, let's plan on doing a couple of episodes that talk about Comic-Con, WonderCon, how Star Trek material is presented at those conventions. And then when you put it out there and you're optimizing all of your marketing copy, all of your posting and promotion copy to include those phrases and those concepts about the conventions and convention life and everything like that, now you're being discoverable by that audience and growing to that audience. And that's one thing that's so important for podcasters to remember, is that so much of your content has to live outside of the podcast. You need to be thinking in terms of, how do I summarize this information outside of the podcast itself? Because especially in a growing world of AI and AI discoverability, AI doesn't listen to podcasts. And it also doesn't have the patience to read your entire transcript, because that takes up too much power and too much water. So it's looking for the content in summarized, concise ways outside of the podcast itself in order to discover that material.
Yeah, I love the way you're thinking about this. It isn't just the event that's important, but it's after the event. And how do you repurpose that content? How do you position that content well after the event and have it for weeks, for months, and keep building that credibility around this one topic and showing that you're the expert, showing that you have the best content and the best discussions around this, whatever we talked about at the, Starfleet Academy. You're going to become a thought leader in that space because you've got all this optimized content just focused on Starfleet Academy.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point there about the connection between credibility and events. I think that there's something just inherent about doing events that speaks to your credibility, right? No one puts on an event with people you've never heard of, right? It's all authorities in their field. And so your credibility goes through the roof, and that's something you need to repurpose again and again to emphasize your credibility when you get that kind of content from an event.
Yeah, like, come on down to the Poduty Podcast Theater. We got shows with a bunch of guys.
Right?
Like,
oh, great. Yeah.
Oh, great.
My ticket.
Sign me up for our next story. We're going to the music industry on this one.
Awesome.
This story pushes the idea of what live podcasts can be. Instead of just talking, No Tags turned their show into a listening experience. They brought artists together, played music, shared stories behind the tracks, and created an atmosphere that you can't replicate through audio alone. This is where live podcasting gets interesting. It's not just about recording in front of people. It's about designing an experience that gives the audience something they can feel in the room and then relive later through the content.
It's so genius the way that the structure there is to capture a moment. And that yeah, it kind of makes me speechless because of how important that is and how different that is from sort of the paradigm that we think about podcasts. Because we think about podcasts as highly researched and highly scripted. And there are some podcasts, of course, that it's just me improvising. But even if you're just improvising, it's on a topic and it's a topic you know about. So when you set up for something that's live and unscripted, and I think that's a great example of how you create a moment. And that's what people are looking for. That they're looking for moments. They're looking for something cool that they can tell their friends about. Did you see this? Did you hear this? Oh, this was so cool. And yeah, those little moments are typically, unscripted and really important.
I feel bad for most kids in the last 25, 30 years of the closest they've had to physical media was like ripped CDs in like the early 2000s. Everybody was burning and stealing music back then. But before that, it's hard to explain to somebody the power that sitting in a friend's room, going through their music collection, they're pulling out their favorite records, cassettes, and they're playing music, they're sharing their experiences with you, and you're just sitting there on a Saturday afternoon, trying new music, hearing new things, talking about things, laughing, goofing around. And that's kind of what this show reminded me of the sitting in a friend's room, and just, finding new tunes, listening to the B-sides for the first time, and like, oh, I never heard this song, but you're experiencing and you're taking in new things and you're having a moment. And I really love the way they put this together. It felt like, just hanging out in a friend's room.
Yeah, I love that analogy, and because it's just so true. That was the era I grew up in, with vinyl records, and going and see your buddy's record collection, and even though you could go to Columbia Records and get 20 records for a penny, if you remember that old promotion, it was not easy to get records sometimes, that your friends got. Or old releases that just weren't available, right? There was no internet. So when a record went out of print, it was gone. So if your buddy had it and you didn't, that was super cool. And you could go and listen to it at their place. Yeah. Replicating that kind of experience is really cool.
I have no idea how Columbia House ever made money. I think all my friends had debt collectors in high school, and they're like, hey, I'm a minor. I can't even sign a contract. Why would you send me 10 CDs for a penny?
Right.
Well, let's keep it going. Speaking of money, we're going to go to Planet Money, and this is what it looks like when a podcast becomes a super powerhouse brand. Planet Money is heading to Boulder for a live show tied to their new book, turning listeners into attendees. This is not just a recording, it's an event built around content people already trust. You have hosts, guests, live storytelling, and a shared experience. This is where podcasting is heading. Shows that build authority can step off the feed and onto the stage, creating new ways to connect and monetize. And we've seen this model for book releases where people used to do morning radio or morning talk shows. We're seeing people now tour as part of a podcast tour to release a book.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, the monetization part of it. Because, especially a podcast at that level, at the level of Planet Money, if you're selling out, a small theater, let's say 500, 600 seats, and everyone paid $40, to be there. And so your gross revenue on ticket sales alone is $25,000. I mean, you want to talk about monetization, and that's not a heavy production type of show either. Okay. You're not bringing in sound and lights and sets and pyrotechnics, as if you were a band. It's just you and a couple people and some microphones on stage. So you're keeping your costs low, your overhead low, and you're making some money. And you do that 10 times, 20 times, if you're that popular, that's a monetization strategy that's really worth it. And like you said, then you're selling merch, you're selling your books on top of that, maybe some hats or something. It's a whole new way. And all these live events, it's such a new thing. It really is. And I think it really speaks to the idea that podcasting is it's been around for a while, but it's really just starting to get its legs and discover what it's all about and what the potential is there for this medium.
Yeah, I've been drawing a lot of parallels between, if you ever hear comedians from the late 70s, early 80s, before there were really established comedy clubs, they were doing comedy in bowling alleys, in the back of Chinese restaurants. They were wherever they could find a space, they were doing it. And podcasting is kind of in this realm where we have people, we have the talent. A lot of people are very comfortable at home in their home studios, but we also know that a lot of people are moving into theaters, into arenas, and they're selling tickets. So in between, even though there isn't that infrastructure yet of how do I get from my mom's basement where I record my podcast to Madison Square Garden, well, I think spots like this our theater that we're sitting in here, these are those stepping stones that's going to help develop that talent. And just like the comedy clubs did in the 80s, where they got people out of the back of the restaurants into clubs, touring clubs around the country, then into arenas and main television. I think that this is the time now, like John's saying, like podcasting is rising and people are catching on to this can be a very fun, very affordable live entertainment, a way to experience live entertainment.
Absolutely.
Well, this goes so fast, John. We're already on our last story.
Oh, you want me to talk more?
Oh no, we're on time. Even though we're going fast, we're still on time. I like to throw in stories related to John. John has some music background. John has some marketing background. So I picked some stories for John. I picked this one for me because it's from Pittsburgh, and I really like this group. It's called the PittsburgHER. This story is all about voice. PittsburgHER is creating the kind of conversations most people only have in private and putting them front and center. What makes this work is not just the topics, it's the format. You have multiple hosts, real perspectives, and audience-submitted questions driving the conversation. This is the kind of show that builds connection fast. And when you build that kind of trust, it opens a door for live events, community engagement, and a loyal audience that wants to be part of the conversation. And when I read this story, that's the first thing I thought of was, they are building the structure to take this show on the road. This would be a great live show.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it really drives home the point that storytelling and empathy are the backbone of great podcasting, no matter what your podcast is. If you are a B2B podcasters like the ones we work with, or B2C, you're like, oh, well, it's not as much story driven. Well, yeah, it is. It totally is, because your customers have pain points. And so this is the story of this, that's just a classic story, right? Your protagonist, your customer, has a problem, the pain point. Now, how do they defeat the antagonist to get that problem solved, right? And so, with this example you're talking about, you're really driving home that storytelling and that empathy angle. I had this screenwriting teacher, Bob McKee, when I was a student at USC, and I was fortunate to have the only semester he ever taught. And he's, considered like the great storytelling scholar. Has this incredible book just called Story, and it's like a textbook, and it's incredible. Anyway, he asked us at the beginning of the semester, why do people go to the movies? Why do people watch movies? And eventually gave us the answer, and it was to see how other people solve their problems. And, here it is 40 years later, and that's still just ringing in my head. And it's just so true. And your story kind of, emphasizes that, is that people go to these live events, especially, and they ask these podcasters, these questions, and what they're looking for are answers. How did you solve this problem? How did you get through this crisis? How did you overcome this situation? And to get that, not just that information of how they did it, but the empathy of like, this is a person who is going through what I am going through and made it to the other side. That's priceless.
Yeah, and something else I loved about this article was, a lot of times people come up with ideas and they're like, oh, they already do that. Here's 5 ladies doing a podcast. Like, oh, maybe that's like The View or like a talk show. But nobody has done it like these 5 have done it. And these are 5 new voices, 5 new perspectives. So if you think you have an idea and you're like, I don't want to get out there, if somebody's already doing that, they're not doing it the way you do it. And you can come up with something that it could be very similar to something else, but it's the way you deliver it. It's your perspective on it. It's your experiences and stories that'll make it unique. And you know that it's a format that works. 5 people sitting around talking stories, current events. You know that it works. So if you do it and you have some friends, you're not copying. You're giving something to the world in your vision, in your history, your perspective, and creating something and giving that out, which nobody else can do it like you do it.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, that it is. It's all about your perspective. And there's the fact that someone's done it before, that the format is the same as something else, has nothing to do with it. I mean, I think you and I probably both grew up on 80s and 90s daytime TV, and there was plenty of room for Ricky Lake and Montel Williams and Sally Jesse Raphael and, on and on and on. But they all had a different perspective. They all had a different personality. They all brought a unique element to the conversation. So that's what you need. What you need is the perspective, not the, hell, if the format was the problem, then all of us podcasters would be out of business because we're all just a person sitting in front of a mic. So, it's got to be about the perspective.
What a great, I never used that example before, but I'm going to use it, in the 80s and 90s, daytime talk shows were all the same. It focused around one host and a panel, and they did that format for 15 years on daytime television, and it just worked. But each one was different. Phil Donahue wasn't like Morton Downey Jr., that's a weird reference, wasn't like Geraldo, wasn't like Sally Jesse Raphael or Jenny Jones or Ricky Lake. They were all different and unique, and that's a great example, and this is a great podcast concept. I'm glad it's happening here in Pittsburgh. I can't wait to see where this goes.
Excellent, yeah. And the other thing to note there is that that format never really went away. It was the distribution style that went away. When the internet came along, all those shows dropped off because nobody knew what this internet thing was going to do to that kind of content. And now we're seeing it. Right now, we're seeing these podcasts that are on Netflix, that are on YouTube, that are on huge platforms that are basically 90s daytime TV. It's just a person and their perspective, and that's it.
That's it. If you take anything from this episode, get yourself a pair of red glasses. You could be the next Sally Jesse Raphael.
Google it, kids.
Yeah. Well, John, this was so much fun. Thank you for your time today. This is the part of the show I turn the floor completely over to you. You can plug, promote, talk about anything you'd like. John, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. All right. Plug away. I don't know if you remember that Saturday Night Live skit. Hey, I will plug. This is what I'm going to plug. So as I talked about earlier, we've kind of been at the intersection of podcasting and AI. And I fully acknowledge the fact that I'm going to be out of a job in 2 years. AI will replace me. It won't replace you. It's not going to replace podcasters. It's not going to replace creators, doers, makers. But all of us on the periphery, all of us who market and promote and do that sort of thing, we're all out of a job. The time's going to come when you create your episode and then you say to your computer, post and promote this. And it will, and it'll do it more effectively than anything that's happening right now. So I'm working hard to put myself out of a job because I see the writing on the wall. And so what we're doing is we're creating that new generation of apps that are all about podcast marketing and podcast creation, ideation, and promotion. And our flagship app is going to be coming out in about 3 weeks. So look for it in early May. It's called podagain.ai. And this is our creation ideation tool. What it does is it taps into your RSS feed and it downloads your entire library of podcasts. So it's especially effective for people who have, 100, 200, 300 podcasts out there. It downloads your entire library, reads the transcripts, listens to the audio, and creates its own large language model based solely on your content. then you go into it like you would ChatGPT and you query it and you say, I want a 10-minute podcast episode about my 4 biggest sugar cookie baking tips. And it will write that script and you can edit it in the interface. And then you can either print out that script and say, okay, this is going to be my new episode, or you can press the button. It will clone your voice and bingo, you have a new podcast episode. But again, what's cool about it, it's based on your material. It's not AI slop. It's your proprietary content reused and reformatted to make new episodes.
Awesome. I'm so glad you said sugar baking tips and not sugar daddy tips. That's where I was like, where's he going with this one?
Where are you going with that? What kind of podcast do you run?
Well, John, thank you so much. Everybody, check out John's links in the show notes. I will update the link to see the tool in a couple of weeks once it comes out. And John, do you remember what time it was?
It's Poduty time.
What time is it?